word. Okay, the idea that all of the princes of Israel, their dedication offerings are repeated, it follows from Jewish tradition, biblical tradition, that sees repetition not as something wrong, not as something bad that we don't want to have as part of our operating system. We moderns don't like to repeat too much, but the biblical world, that was a very important element. So on one hand, it's just part of the biblical world to repeat. So secondly, it's also a very important element to emphasize. Everybody gets credited for what they do. Now, two of the laws that are found in Parshat Naso that are extremely important and are, first of all, we have the idea of Mesotah, the only listing of a trial by ordeal in the Bible. And what that is that if a woman is suspected by her husband, of course, it's always the women bear the brunt of the problems, I understand that. But if a man suspects his wife of committing adultery, but there's no real proof, but she's acted in a way that is considered to be improper in that society, there was a ritual at the temple in which she takes place. And probably, even though a lot of traditionalists don't like the explanation I'm going to give, from the description of what takes place, it's really almost a psychosomatic test of the woman. If she's guilty of doing something wrong, then she will fail the test. Because it's really not very much. She drinks some water that has been soaked, barley soaked water, and some ink from the documents in it. But most likely it's just playing on one's conscience. The second one is the idea of the Nazir, that if a person takes a vow to be a Nazir, a Nazarite, they will not cut their hair during the period of time that they're Nazir. They don't drink wine or hard intoxicants, and they have to be very careful in terms of their ritual purity. We know of the story of Samson, that Samson was a Nazir from birth, but normally it seems to have been a special kind of ceremony of self denial that was taken by a person for some reason. The rabbi suggested that somebody who saw the ordeal of the woman who was accused of adultery might think about their own bad behavior and want to do something to set themselves on the right path as well by going through this kind of a restriction. What is also interesting is that at the end of it, we're told that there are certain sacrifices that the Nazir brings after their period of at least a 30-day Naziriteship. And one of them is what is called in Hebrew a chatat, a guilt offering, a sin offering. And fact of the matter is, it has nothing necessarily to do with sin, but it has that designation, and also is used when somebody wants to atone for a sin that they committed. But in this case, it probably was not that intent. But the rabbi said, why this particular offering? And so a wonderful suggestion was made. It was because by denying oneself the legitimate pleasures of life, in this case, denying wine, that a person will not drink wine during this period of time, one in a sense is committing a sin. God gave us all kinds of wonderful things in this world. They're supposed to be used properly and rationally and in a controlled sense, but they're to be used. There's nothing wrong with wine. There's nothing wrong with alcohol as long as it's taken care of properly. Certainly we know there are people with what's a problem for them, and that's a different story. But the ordinary person has no problem with having a drink of wine occasionally, and certainly so many of our rituals are built around using wine. So the rabbi said to deny yourself a legitimate pleasure is wrong. And that also goes to the idea, that's why Judaism never really developed an asceticism of celibacy. And that idea of not marrying, not having children, was not something that was saluted in Jewish tradition. All right. All right, so what I wanted to do tonight.
Sorry, Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, let's just say, for argument's sake, because you're talking about unfaithful behavior and putting in that situation the women through a terrible ordeal. Let's say, for argument's sake, a couple is married, baby is born, and the baby, let's just call him Max, just for argument's sake. Let's say Max looks nothing like the father and only like the mother.
Okay.
So
In
what?
which case, let's say, for argument's sake, let's say Max looks only like his mother. That can only be a blessing for him.
Lucky boy.
But what would the mother in that, historically, what would let's say the father decided for whatever reason
Let's use. Yeah. Well, first of all, the ancients had no understanding of genetics.
Genetics, yeah.
Right. So really, and as a matter of fact, mostly the way the Talmud describes it is that, since we think about it, the woman has menses, so that's red. A man has semen, which is white. Right? So the woman supplies the red parts of the child, and the man supplies the white parts of the child. And in most ancient cultures, the man was really considered to be the source of the child. Ultimately, the mother was the host for birth. But the ancients thought it mostly came from the man. Okay, which is why this whole issue about adultery becomes so much a part of the ancient world, and the issues there, and virginity for marriage, and all those kinds of things. So that was part of it. But I thought you were going to go somewhere else, because I should have noted that the ordeal of the what they call the mesotah, the bitter waters, was ended during the rabbinic period. The rabbi said, in order for it to be effective, the men had to be also faithful husbands. Since so many people became unfaithful in later generations, it no longer worked. And so they eliminated the ordeal altogether, which is a rabbinic way of getting rid of something that they didn't really think was a good idea, I think.
So historically, what would be an appropriate test of fidelity that the rabbis would suggest in that very unlikely scenario?
No. All what you had were the following: adultery was proven by witnesses that a couple could have had sexual relations with each other. The grounds for that the rabbis understood, based upon the biblical account, I got these bugs running out here, was that the wife had been warned by her husband not to be alone with this gentleman, and she still insisted on being alone with him. There's no proof that there was any adultery whatsoever. That's why the ordeal takes place. And the woman has the option to confess and be just divorced, or go through the ordeal. So presumably the ordeal would only have been brought for two reasons. One, the husband is jealous, which is also not such a nice thing. And two, the woman's behavior was somehow in such a way that gave rise to suspicion. And again, in the ancient world, right, and there was a double standard. And since a man can have more than one wife, that was not the issue. It was always the woman who bore the brunt of the issue there. But that's why, for example, you asked the question, when Isaac, Abraham's and Sarah's son, was born, the Torah tells us that there was a brief episode in which she was taken by Abimelech. It was Abimelech episode, I think. I forget. I should remember that right off him. But it was Abimelech episode. And there was suspicion. Hey, the two of them haven't had a child, and here he's 90 years old, and she's 70 years old, 100 years old, and 70 years old, and right, and they haven't had a child, and certainly it must be that Avimelech is the father. So lo and behold, Isaac looks like the direct image of his father Abraham, to prove that he was the father. Furthermore, they said, well, it had to be a foundling, that Sarah could not have had a child. So not only did she in public nurse her child, but she nursed everybody's child who was around that needed to be nursed. So she produced so much milk to provide for all their needs. So, certainly the understanding was such things could happen, issues about parentage and all of that. But this was how it is handled. If there's no proof, in an ancient world, there was no way of proving. As a matter of fact, I just had a discussion with one of my colleagues. We were discussing certain legal procedures. When a person converts to Judaism, a woman converts to Judaism, when there is a divorce, theoretically, and it's not always, both of these are not always followed, but the tradition was you had to wait 3 months before you could have a marriage after divorce or after conversion to prove parentage, to prove who the father was. Because by 3 months, a woman normally would be showing that she was pregnant. So these are all kinds of things that were dealt with in the ancient world as issues that they had to deal with. Okay, answer your question. And again, I say mazel tov to Max that he chose the right parent to follow in there, looking like. Hi, Paulina. Okay. Yeah, have a question?
Yeah, we have a question completely unrelated to marital issues. Was Jesus a Nasir, or was it just Jesus the Nazarene?
Jesus called a Nazarite because he comes from the city of Nazareth. Nazir. That's the name. That's where the name comes in, because one of the famous episodes of one of the miracles he's supposed to do is changing water into wine. If he's a Nazir, he's not supposed to be near the wine. But no, his designation, Notzri, it seems to derive from coming from Natzer, from Nazareth. That's what I understood it to be.
Okay, and I have one more sub question, really strange one. I know it's about Jesus again, but someone just told it to me recently that he tattooed the name of God on his arm.
Okay.
Is that true? That seems pretty sacrilegious.
Well, who told the story?
Just a guy from my synagogue.
Okay, there you go. What it was is that you have these stories that were accepted by Christians of Jesus being able to perform miracles. And so the Jewish audience that rejected any kind of divinity around Jesus, though might say they may say maybe he did do some of these things. So how could he have done some of these things? Well, it was understood in Jewish tradition that there was great power in the name of God, the Yud He Vav He. One example is, we find that in the Middle Ages repeated, was that some of the rabbis knew how to create a golem. A golem would be a man out of clay. They would write the name of God on a piece of paper, and they are on the forehead of this man of clay, or they would put it on a piece of paper and stick it in his mouth, and he would come to life. So there was power in the name of God. So there was an anti-Christian, bad-natured explanation for the miracles of Jesus. Either he tattooed or wrote the name of God on his arm that allowed him to do certain things, or he put it on a piece of parchment and sewed the parchment under his skin. Okay, so there was a collection of these very anti-Christian, anti-Jesus polemics, more folklore than anything else, that circled about in the ancient Jewish world. And so this person who tells you this thing about the tattoo is coming from that tradition. And it's certainly not accepted normative Judaism. There's no reason for that. We just reject, assume the stories are not accurate. But that was what was the basis of it. Okay,
That makes sense. Thank you.
you're welcome. Don't go around sharing that story. Okay, so now it's clear that Judaism has always had different kinds of expressions that took place during the course of the millennia. Josephus and rabbinic sources themselves acknowledge that there were different groups amongst the Jewish people at the Second Temple period, towards the end of the Second Temple. Josephus makes direct reference to the Pharisees, to the Sadducees, to the Essenes, and to what he called the Zealots. And so we know that the Essenes are also mentioned in rabbinic literature. The Pharisees were certainly the ancestors of rabbinic Judaism. And one, especially today, some are come to say that even Christianity originally was merely a Jewish sect, one of the number of Jewish groups that existed. When the temple is destroyed, the Sadducees and the Essenes disappear from the picture. Not to say that their influence may not have lived on, but they disappear basically from the picture. The Zealots lose out with the war. And what's left as the major leadership of the Jewish people are the Pharisees. Christianity has separated by the end of the destruction of the Second Temple and have gone their own way. But a lot of modern historians, not traditionalists, but modern historians, like to talk about Judaisms. A man by the name of Jacob Neusner, who's done a tremendous amount of work in this area, also a very interesting and controversial individual. He doesn't really believe there was a such thing as Judaism without the S on the end. He would say there always were Judaisms. And over the course of time, as Jews spread out throughout the world, they became divided in some ways. You had customs that arose in different parts of the world. You had Sephardic Jews in Spain and North Africa, later in Turkey. You had the Eastern Jews of North Africa, Iraq, India, Persia. You had the Ashkenazic Jews who went through in Europe. No one ever considered them to be separate and distinct from the Jewish people. While there were differences, the core was much the same. We do have in the 9th century, 8th, 9th century, the Karaite movement, which was a sectarian movement within Judaism, and that broke away and ultimately just was left for a handful that still exists today. But while everyone was cognizant of variations of observance, they were always just seen as different customs, different minhagim that were followed by Jews in different places. Right? And so, for example, Ashkenazic Jews, when they say the blessing over the wine, they say Borei Pri Hagafen. Sephardic Jews say Borei Pri Hagefen. It's just a slight difference in the accenting of the word. There are other areas where Sephardic liturgy may have extra words that Ashkenazic liturgy doesn't. And then there were liturgical poetry that became part of the Ashkenazic prayer books that were not part of the Sephardic prayer books. There were differences in issues of kashrut, etc. And so you had to be aware of these, and sometimes they created difficulties. But no one questioned them as being anything other than a legitimate variation of Jewish practice. No different from somebody who might part their hair on the left side versus somebody who parts their hair on the right side. So we do begin to have something, but it kind of plays its way out, or plays out differently, was with the rise of the Hasidic movement. And there was great animosity for a while between, and still actually does exist to some extent, some elements in the Jewish world against the Hasidim. But again, if anything, they were considered maybe making mistakes, going the wrong way in some situation. But most Jews were not prepared to say that they constituted a different Judaism. All right. So now we're coming to the modern era. And this is where things begin to take a very clear change. Because the first, what is usually called movement in Judaism, to identify itself as a separate movement, Jewish, but as a clear, defined movement, which eventually has its own rabbis, its own schools, its own philosophy, was for Reform Judaism. And then what happens is with the French Revolution, which we touched upon before, and how the French Revolution had a tremendous impact upon Jews. Jews were recognized as citizens of the countries in which they lived. They often, ghettos were often abolished. Jewish special badges were no more. People could live where they wanted to live, dress how they wanted to dress, do whatever occupations they wanted to do. And it wasn't simple, but that's the basic idea behind it. And so many Jews moved out of the Jewish neighborhood for whatever reason. Some of them began to speak the language of their neighbors. Not that they didn't necessarily before, but especially in Eastern Europe, Yiddish was an important element. We're talking right now mostly about Western Europe. France, Germany, the parts of Eastern Europe that were under Germanic influence, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, England, and later on the United States and in Canada. So they began to move out of their districts. Some sent their kids to public schools and universities. Sometimes they gave their kids a Jewish education, sometimes they neglected it, and sometimes they weren't careful about observance of Jewish law. Now, in 1815, after Napoleon's defeat, when Jews lost the rights of citizenship in several countries, many Jews became Christian in order to retain those rights. Now, it was not so much that they wanted to be Christians. They wanted the rights and privileges that society had to offer, and they were desirous of them for whatever reason. Thoughtful Jews were concerned, what's going on? They could see what's going on. What do we do? How do we counteract what is happening? Because it wasn't really that so many Jews became enamored with Christianity. As a matter of fact, most of these were bad Jews by the time they converted, and when they converted, they were usually pretty bad Christians too. Right? They didn't take it very seriously. Right? So we had a phenomenon on the intellectual level, which was influenced by what was going on intellectually. And that was the rise of what was known in German as Wissenschaft des Judentums. Any German speakers there? All right, Wissenschaft, the science of Judaism. Now, if you think of any courses you take at university, history, scientific research, experimentation, understanding and development of ideas, etc., are all part and parcel of the modern university approach, at least it's supposed to be. Everyone recognizes that the societies develop and change over the course of history. Well, Jewish tradition did not look at it that way. Judaism was seen as really unchanged for the most part. The Talmud was not subject to historical pressures in the sense of that modern sociologists might say. So there were these Jewish scholars, usually they came from the rabbinic groupings, but they studied at university. They studied philosophy. They studied history as it was taught in the 19th century in the universities. And they felt that Judaism should be studied in the same way. First of all, that means Judaism was the equal to Christianity, to any other intellectual endeavor. But if it's going to be the equal to that endeavor, it has to be studied in the same way that those endeavors took place. So the idea of introducing Jewish studies into the university, which we today still have, creates a kind of scholarship that allowed for the complete independent interpretation of traditional texts. Right? I'm not talking about the Bible right now, but of course that eventually becomes a very big issue with the greater rise of biblical criticism. But even the rise of Jewish traditions, Talmudic traditions, the Talmud itself. And so, for example, a man by the name of Leopold Zunz, he was born in 1794, died in 1886. He was one of the major figures in this movement. He devoted most of his work to rabbinic literature. And he wanted to show how Judaism had grown and developed after the Bible. You know, for Christians, Judaism was over when the Bible was over. Jesus comes, the New Testament comes, and that's the end of what Judaism should be. And whatever Judaism exists is just a petrified remnant of the pre-Christian era. So he sought to examine, to investigate Jewish tradition, the rabbinic literature. And for example, when the Prussian government forbade preaching sermons in German synagogues on the grounds that the sermon was an exclusively Christian institution, right? Some of the rabbis, some of the early Reform rabbis, their reform was they would give sermons on Shabbos morning. That may not seem very strange today, and indeed a lot of people would like rabbis not to give sermons on Shabbos morning anymore, but that became a very important element. The Prussian government said, no, rabbis cannot give sermons because Jews did not give sermons. Christians gave sermons. So what does Zunz do? Zunz investigated the Jewish sermon. And he shows how the Midrash, biblical Midrash, the rabbinic exegesis of Midrash, and of the Siddur, a prayer book, developed from sermonics that were used by the rabbis. That many of the Midrashim, the Midrashic collections, really were essentially sermons. And whether or not they were done every Shabbos is irrelevant. But he wanted to show that this was purely part and parcel of Jewish tradition as well as Christian tradition. And so he published the history of the Jewish sermon in 1832. Now, Zunz and others such as Gratz, who were all part of this Wissenschaft movement, for the most part, they, one, were not interested in changing Judaism, and two, they thought Judaism was going to die. In some ways, they saw themselves giving a decent burial to Judaism. And so their scholarly labors, they worked on as put Judaism as a historical world, but had apologetic overtones and often ignored matters of contemporary relevance, unlike what Zunz did with the sermons. And the fact of the matter is, without going into the polemics of it, the way Judaism is studied at the university today, ideally, is in the same methodology. Because if you're teaching Talmud in university, you're not teaching a religion. You're not teaching Talmud as a religious exercise. You're teaching Talmud as an example of one religion's approach to understanding itself and its history, its religious corpus. And many years ago, when I was in El Paso, Texas, I taught. I was adjunct associate professor, adjunct professor. It was an adjunct. Anyway, I didn't get paid, and I had to pay for parking. But they had in the University of Texas system, they had Bible classes that could be taught by clergy of the various movements. But I taught it as a secular, like any secular professor should teach Bible. I did not, I gave different approaches and different understandings and left it at that. I wasn't out to convince anybody the right or wrong of Jewish tradition. And so many of the Jewish scholarship that takes place today still follows in the pattern of Wissenschaft, although there was often condemned, and many times, many of the professors today may teach in that style, but they live Jewishly in terms of their own lives, and they're not necessarily anti-religion or neutral towards religion. All right, but there were other voices seeing what was happening in the Jewish community, concerned with Jews moving away from Judaism, and they felt that it was necessary to reform Judaism to make it more enticing to modern Jews. Modern Jews being the 19th century. One of them, for example, Rabbi Abraham Geiger, was a very important element in the early Reform movement. And some of these rabbis, they wanted to incorporate more music into the synagogue. We mentioned the idea of sermons in the local language. And many of them look to the Protestant church in Germany and France as a model for what they thought the synagogue should be. And that's why certain changes took place. The moving of the Torah reading to the front, the pulpit front in the front and facing the congregation, sometimes even reading towards the congregation. The vernacular, shortening the prayers, eliminating many of the piyutim, sometimes saying parts of the prayers in English, introduction of organ music. And slowly they sought to what they considered to be reforming of Jewish practice, not because they were anti-Jewish, which many of the Orthodox might feel, but they thought this was a way to save Judaism and save Jews to be Jews. So between 1810 and 1820, congregations, this was taking place mostly in Germany and France at this time, introduced mixed seating. They only observed one day of the holidays. They made use of the choir much more so than had been done. They discarded traditions and rituals. Circumcision was not necessarily practiced. The Hebrew language was eliminated from the liturgy. The hope of restoration of Jews in Israel was renounced, and they no longer had a bar mitzvah celebration, but a confirmation ceremony. Felt kashrut was no longer important. Some even shifted the Shabbat observance to Sunday. and traditional restrictions of Shabbat observance were ignored. All right? So this was something that was going on. And some of these reformers immigrated to the United States and later on into Canada in the mid 1800s with a large influx of German Jews. Now, prior to the 1850s, 1848, 50, etc., the bulk of American Jewry was of Sephardic descent. Whether or not they were religiously observant, their synagogues were traditional synagogues. They had no concept, and you see today in the Sephardic world, there's much less pressure to change the synagogue practice, whether or not the congregants observe completely. So when these German Jews came to America, they joined the local synagogue, which was Sephardic, which was Orthodox. And without question, soon there were disputes and fights that broke out. And the first Reform group was formed by a number of individuals that split from congregation Beth Elohim in Charleston, South Carolina, when their demands for reforms were rejected. And this began to be a very strong movement throughout the United States. It was molded by a man by the name of Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise, who came to the United States in 1846 from Bohemia. First, he spent his years in Albany, New York, and then he moved to Cincinnati, which in those days was the frontier. And eventually, he wrote the first Siddur edited for American worshipers, Minhag America, I called it. He founded the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in 1873, which today is known as the Union for Reform Judaism. In 1875, importantly, he founded Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Now, when that was I'll come back to it in a minute, its founding. And then in 1889, founded the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform rabbis today. And by 1880, more than 90% of American synagogues were Reform. This was then uprooted by the major surge of heavily Orthodox non-German Jews coming to North America. But when these Jews came to North America, to them, the Reformed synagogues looked like churches. To them, there was no difference to them, and the rabbis preached in robes, the men and women sat together, they had choirs, they had organs, they had hymnals, and many of the American Reform rabbis had adopted many of the more radical reforms that had taken place in Germany. In 1909, there still was a sense of, there was a line. So the example, 1909, the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, formally declared its opposition to intermarriage. And although they decried as archaic and barbarian, the practice of circumcision still remained a central rite amongst even Reformed Jews. Now, they reach a peak of radicalism in what was known as the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform, which, amongst other things, dismisses such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress as anachronisms that only obstruct spirituality in the modern age. The platform stressed that Reformed Jews must only be accepting of laws that they feel elevate and sanctify our lives, and must reject those customs and laws that are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So if you didn't think it was in keeping with modern life, goodbye. They were and while the Zionist movement was beginning, these Reform leaders were mostly anti-Zionist. They had no desire to return to the land of Israel. They saw nothing there for them. And even sometimes were very anti-Zionist as well. Now, as the years passed, and there were some beginnings of a flow back towards somewhat more traditional aspects of Judaism. And the what so-called Columbus platform in 1937 reincorporated some of the discarded practices and constitute what now we call modern Reform Judaism, and began to look somewhat more favorably upon the Zionist idea. In the early 19th century, I mentioned this earlier, with the rise of biblical criticism, they began to deny divine authorship of the Torah, and they made a bifurcation between those biblical laws that were ethical, which they considered to be binding, and the rest of halakha was no longer viewed to be as normative. In a sense, many of them said that the prophets had really ruled out some of the basis of traditional rabbinic interpretation, which is also a very Christian idea. So, going back, pulling the clock back a little bit, before the onslaught of Eastern European Jews to North America, Reform Judaism was American Judaism. There was a very small Canadian Jewish community at that time, and they all stayed more or less Orthodox at that time. Now, in opposition to the early Reform, so we have to go back now, there were those Jews who were not interested in abandoning Jewish practice. They wanted to maintain their traditions and adhere to Jewish law, while at the same time engaging with a post-Enlightenment society. And this group was represented and developed by the work and thought by the work and through the thought of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. And Hirsch held that Judaism demands an application of Torah thought to the entire realm of human experience, and including secular disciplines. And this philosophy was termed Torah im derech eretz, Torah with the way of the world. It was orthodox, and the word orthodox means right belief. Okay? This was the first group to call itself Orthodox, and therefore they are coming into being as a result and a reaction to Reform. So modern Orthodoxy is actually a movement that came into being because of the Reform movement. And the story of what became known in those days as neo-Orthodoxy was, interestingly enough, one of the first acts was to withdraw from the Jewish community. In Germany, the Jewish community still had certain status, certain standing. The synagogues were all supported by communal funds that were raised through taxation. There was a council that decided how the Jewish funds were spent by the Jewish community. But Hirsch wanted to get away from that which was dominated by the Reform leadership. And so in Frankfurt, he withdrew, and his congregation withdrew from that Jewish community, as it were, and set up their own Jewish community. So modern Orthodoxy essentially maintains and carries on this kind of broad concept that Hirsch had come about. To be part of the modern world, Hirsch wore clerical garb. He gave sermons in German, but He did not change the liturgy. He did not change Jewish law. He did not seek to reform the synagogue, but to maintain Jewish tradition while also permitting secular education, while also being part of the general community. Now, he was not only opposed by the reform, within the Orthodox world, there was a group that was very much opposed to him and to what he was doing. And they saw any kind of modus vivendi, for example, giving sermons on a regular basis on Shabbos, as being anathema. And especially in further Eastern Europe, groups like Agudath Israel, which was established in 1912, took a far stricter approach towards Torah. And one of the famous mottos that was declared was Hechadash Asur Mina Torah. The new is forbidden by the Torah. It's a play on words. It's a play on the fact that the wheat that was harvested just after Passover, that was not already taken root before then, couldn't be eaten until the next Omer time. That's called Chadash. Chadash was the new grains. They were not eaten until after Pesach had begun the next year. And so that meant Chadash, that which is newly planted, which had not taken root before the proper time, could not be used. So, but playing on that, so they sought to emphasize maintaining very strict separation from non-Jewish practices. This is essentially what Haredi Judaism is. The Haredi world, or you could is the largest element today of what is known as Orthodox. The modern Orthodox are a much smaller percentage of what are seen today as Orthodox, but when the reality is, especially outside of Israel, many of the Haredim are in business. They may not be all this. There are doctors, there are lawyers. They may be more in the area of trades and business, but they are very modern in certain ways. But they seek very clearly to distinguish themselves by looking different from the rest of the world, mostly living in fairly segregated communities. And anything that was not the way it was done before is just not done. But again, that's not really 100% true. Yes.
Rabbi, so seeing as the Haredi Judaism is the Orthodox majority, would then Hasidim technically be considered
Okay, when we look, if you look at the Orthodox world, you could divide the Orthodox world up into maybe, well, yeah, all right, you have, quote, modern Orthodox. Modern Orthodox would be where the men would wear normal Western garb. They might even wear T-shirts. They may or may not have tzitzit on. They mostly do wear tzitzit, but they don't necessarily wear it out. They generally cover their head in public, but they may just use a hat or a cap or a yarmulke. Within that community, women will, it's becoming more and more that they're covering their hair more than they used to, but some didn't necessarily always cover their hair. And when they go to the synagogues, you'll see some of them wearing a hat, which is hardly much of a hair covering. Right? And they very clearly are middle class, upper middle class, doctor, lawyer, etc., baker, etc. Okay. you now have also in recent years what has been called open orthodoxy, which is a big debate on what that means. But it is the left wing of the Orthodox world, giving many more possibilities for women's participation under certain circumstances in synagogues, sometimes even allowing women to chant part of the service, to read from the Torah under certain conditions. Most of the Orthodox world say they've gone beyond the pale, but all right. So that's modern and open Orthodox. The Haredi world is broadly divided into two groups. One being the Hasidim and all the various Hasidic groupings that are there, all the various subgroups of the different rebbes, Satmar, Ger, Chabad, and then what is sometimes called Litvisher or Yeshivish or Yeshiva Orthodoxy. They are not Hasidim, although Hasidic influence has had a deep impact, I think, on that world. And the men too tend to wear the dark suits and the black hats and are much more stringent in interpretation of Jewish law. And more often would be found going to yeshiva and studying much longer in yeshiva and maybe even staying in the yeshiva world for the rest of their life if they can. So that really is the spectrum of the Orthodox world today. You also have, which should be noted, is you also have Sephardic Jews who can be found in any of those derivations. For the most part, Sephardic synagogues have not changed any in shape or form, right? But their clientele, the membership runs the gamut. And in Israel, the influence of the Haredim has influenced the Sephardic Jews, so that many of the Haredi Sephardi Jews wear the black hat, for example. Walking down the street, they might see because of their complexion, they look darker from the ancestry, what have you. But their garb is that. And in both cases, and in all three cases, women tend to wear long skirts, or at least skirts that are below the knees. And married women always cover their hair, at least with a scarf covering everything, part of the hair, or a wig. And there's some like the belt, as the Bells does it, I think. The women wear a wig with a hat on top of the wig. Okay. So that's the broad division. In Israel, you have a huge Haredi community, and their educational system is very segregated from the rest of the educational system. In Canada, United States, in Western Europe, and other places, Orthodox have a much greater attendance at day schools, much higher affiliation to sending their kids to a Hebrew day school. And many follow that up with going to study in Israel for a year or two or three. Okay. So what is interesting, and I don't want to spend too much more time here, is that this whole pandemic thing is a big question of how that's going to affect the Orthodox world in terms of synagogue affiliation. There's a far lesser need in the Orthodox world for clergy, for professionals running synagogue services. Right? It's not uncommon. For example, in my neighborhood here in Thornhill, in the wintertime, especially when it gets cold, there are a lot of minions that are held Friday night in people's homes. They don't want to walk in the cold. They want to schlep to the synagogue. So they have a minion at home. And some have had minions during this pandemic. So how many are they going to go back to the synagogue? Well, there are lots of issues there. But certainly in the Orthodox world, the large synagogues have tended to be much fewer because you have to walk to synagogue, and the bigger the synagogue, the greater the catch basin, and then farther to walk, and not necessarily the need of all the things that are provided. And as more of the Orthodox world becomes more Haredi, and we'll come back maybe later tonight, less and less need for some of these things in terms of somebody doing it for you. I dare say most conservative synagogues, if there wasn't a professional clergy, most of the people would not know what to do. It's just reality, unfortunately. We try to train, and many have been trained and learned, but that's just reality. Where I told you, I daven in an Orthodox shul. Well, I used to daven in an Orthodox shul. Right now, I daven in my living room. But where I follow my own minhagim, at Beth Avram Yosef Tenenbaum, where I go to the Bayit, there is no professional cantor. The rabbi will sometimes actually cantor, but lay people. It's all lay people reading Torah, all of that sort of thing. Okay. Now, where reform owes a lot to Wissenschaft, to this modernization of study, the denial of the divine origin of the Torah, the denial of the binding quality of Jewish law. Those are the polar opposites of the Orthodox world. For the most part, the Orthodox world rejects any kind of Wissenschaft, any kind of critical studies, even if it's only in the Talmud, much less the Bible, tend to deny history as being an element in the development of Jewish law, and do not believe that Judaism needs to be reformed, the laws need to be changed in any way, shape, or form. There are anti-Zionists, there are pro-Zionists within the Orthodox world. There are some who are interested in somewhat changing the roles of women in the synagogue life. Some are very much opposed to it. Some synagogues, they've even had women presidents. Other synagogues, the rabbis had said it's forbidden for a woman to be president of the synagogue. All of these are going on in the Orthodox world today. It comes back to some of this a bit later on, because I see it's already 8:30. Now, coinciding with the rise of reform and the Wissenschaft, there was also another grouping which was known, at least by some, as historical Judaism. Historical Judaism was essentially the creature of what we call positive historical Judaism, developed in the 1850s as a reaction to the more liberal religious positions taken by the Reform movement. And it was also, especially in the United States, referred to as conservative, but it was meant to signify Jews should attempt to conserve Jewish tradition rather than reform or abandon it. So it has nothing to do with politics. Right? And that's why the conservative movement in modern times is often referred to as Masorti, especially outside of the United States and Canada. And what essentially the mythology of the conservative movement's beginnings was that Rabbi Zachariah Frankel, who was a German rabbi, again, the normal background rabbis at that time. He did study in university, but he was fairly in what we might consider to be Orthodox world. But he was kind of on the fence, and he attended some of the conferences that the early Reform rabbis had. And at least in theory, he finally rejected the Reform movement when it wanted to reject the primacy of the Hebrew language in Jewish prayer. And so his reaction to what took place was to create a school called the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, Germany. And at the seminary, Frankel taught that Jewish law was not static, but rather it always developed in response to changing conditions. And that's why he called his approach towards Judaism positive historical, which meant that one should have a positive attitude towards accepting Jewish law and tradition as normative, yet one should be open to developing the law in the same way and fashion as always historically developed. He rejected the innovations of Reform Judaism as insufficiently based on Jewish history and communal practice. But he did use modern historical scholarship in analyzing Jewish texts and developing Jewish law, which set him apart from the neo-Orthodoxy of Germany. He didn't say you couldn't make some changes, but the changes had to develop, they had to grow, they had to evolve, as they'd always done. See, once you take a historical approach and you see that Judaism of the 10th century and Judaism of the 15th century and Judaism of the 20th century were not identical. Changes did come about, things did move, with or without any major input. Let's just take the ban on polygamy. Now, the ban on polygamy only came about after a point in time when most Jews did not practice polygamy. Had most Jews practiced polygamy, it would never have been able to be enforced. The wearing of the talit katan that Jewish males wear, that came into being because Jewish men didn't wear necessarily garb that was completely separate and distinct from their neighbors. So if you wanted to have something, you had to. So these developed over the course of time. And historical research could help give you ideas how they came about, where they came from. It might give you impetus for making some minor adjustments and changes as time went on. Now, this was, again, like with Reform and like with Neo-Orthodoxy, began in Germany, but the real big change came about in the United States. In 1883, remember I mentioned the Hebrew Union College that was founded by Rabbi Wise, Isaac Mayer Wise. Now, not Isaac, yeah, Isaac Mayer Wise. So he founded it in 1875, according to this notes here. And when they had their first graduating class, well, first of all, before they had their first class, he meant it to be, or at least he claimed, it was going to be a school for American rabbis. It was across the border. It was, there were traditionalists, there were more or less Orthodox men, Salvatore Marias and others, who were asked to involve themselves in the creation of this institution. And Mize promised them that this would be not a Reform institution, but an American institution. And so they were finally enamored with that claim at the first banquet of the first graduating class from Hebrew Union College in 1883, which is known in the historical trade as the Treifa banquet, because every kosher concept was violated at this banquet. Every single one. And there's debate, was it intentional, not intentional? It's hard to say how it wasn't intentional. I won't go into it. If you want to look, it's fun to look up the menu for that banquet, clams on the half shell and all kinds of other stuff. So the more traditionalists broke away from this Hebrew Union College, and the Sephardi rabbis Salvatore Marias and H. Pereira Mendez helped in founding what was called the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, JTS, in New York City as a more traditional alternative to Hebrew Union College. And originally, again, it was thought that this would be an institution for everybody who wasn't Reformed. But again, because of some of the approaches that were taken in education there, and even though the Union of Orthodox Congregations in 1898, well, it had been founded as supportive of the seminary, they broke away from the seminary, and because they felt the academic approach was not the way they wanted to approach Jewish learning. Had a tough time. The seminary lacked permanent funding, ordaining very few rabbis. Though interesting enough, one of the most important in the English world, Rabbi Hertz of the Hertz Chumash, you may be familiar with, there are still around some. He was the chief rabbi of South Africa and the chief rabbi of England, of the United Kingdom, was the first graduate of JTS. But anyway, under the efforts of Cyrus Adler, who was professor of Semitic languages at Johns Hopkins University, and a number of wealthy German Reform Jews, including Jacob Schiff, David and Simon Guggenheim, Meyer Sulzberger, and Louis Marshall, all contributed $500,000 to this faltering Jewish Theological Seminary. And then in 1902, they brought a scholar by the name of Solomon Schechter to lead the seminary. He gained fame already, and he brought a number of important scholars of that day, Louis Ginsburg, Alexander Marx, Israel Friedlander, Mordechai Kaplan. All of these men were brought, and they developed the conservative seminary, Jewish Theological Seminary of America, gave rise to the United Synagogue of America, and gave rise to the Rabbinical Assembly, which are all the conservative movement organs. One of the best things the seminary did was create a wonderful library, one of the finest Judaic libraries in the world, and educated most of the scholars who became the mid-century, end of the middle of the second, up to the 70s and 80s of the 20th century, sources for scholarship in universities, Jewish scholarship. Up until the Second World War, the picture was a little bit blurry. Reform was still the largest, but following the Second World War, both again, mostly the United States we're talking about, the Reform movement had been the largest movement. What happened, though, was after the war, Jews were moving out of the cities, moving to the suburbs, moving away from the core. They were moving away from the Orthodox world that they had grown up in, because most of the Jews at that day were Orthodox, or at least ostensibly Orthodox. The Reform synagogues to them were church-like. They couldn't see themselves there. And the conservative movement, which was neither Orthodox and it wasn't Reform, was in the middle, that satisfied their needs. And so up until the 70s, the conservative movement grew till it became the largest of the movements in North America. And but once it reached its peak, it began its downfall. Be interesting for somebody to finally explain what has happened. But this is my vision of what has transpired since the 1950s. I grew up in the 50s. I grew up in a traditional, what I consider a very traditional conservative synagogue. In the 60s, my generation, all the upheaval that took place during the 60s was felt in the religious world as well. There was a revolt to some degree against the large synagogues, where they considered to be large, sterile synagogues. Chavurot were created, small gatherings where people would do their own thing together. They lost faith in, like I said, in some of these synagogues. we begin to see a change in things. In the 1990s, the conservative household of those who were associated with the synagogue, 43% of them belonged to the conservative synagogues, 35% Reform, 16% Orthodox. Again, this is the US. Now in 2000, the survey showed that only 33% of synagogue-affiliated American Jews belonged to a conservative synagogue. And the latest thing that I saw when I was looking for some figures this evening before the class, first of all, about a quarter of US Jewish adults do not identify with Jewish religion. They identify themselves as Jewish, but not by religion. What was the numbers here? I printed it out. Obviously, I lost it here. Oh, anyway, Reform now is about 33% of, oh, here it is. Okay, wrong page. Now, about 35% of those Jews who are affiliated in the United States identify as Reform. 18% conservative, 10% Orthodox. That's of Jews, all right? So the majority, a large portion doesn't identify with any of the movements. We're seeing that the largest numbers are also influenced by a different statistic. It says younger Jewish adults are more likely than older Jews to identify as Orthodox. Among the Jews 18 to 29, 17% self-identify as Orthodox, compared with just 3% of Jews 65 and older. And fully 1 in 10 US Jewish adults under the age of 30 are Haredim, or ultra-Orthodox, 11%, compared with 1% of Jews 65 or older. So that's been a change in growth that way. But let's look at what has happened to get to this point. All right, so first of all, we had this upheaval, social upheaval that was taking place in general. Any of you ever hear of the Whole Earth Catalog? You're not no hippies. Okay, so the Whole Earth Catalog was back to the earth kind of thing. How to make bread, how to do this, how to do that. It was very good if you're going to have a hippie commune to have that book on hand. Well, a Jewish response to that was the Jewish catalog, which told you how to make challah, how to tie your own tzitzit, how to do different kinds of Jewish things, whether or not it was the Orthodox way or not. Okay, so you begin to have that. You have these rise of chavurot, which were not communes in the way that the hippie communes were, because these were places for people, they may have a living quarter, but to pray and study together. You had the 6-Day War. The 6-Day War had a tremendous impact on Jews in North America, prepared to identify with being Jewish. Kippot, yarmulkes began to appear more. Orthodoxy, which had everybody thought was gone, was going to be buried, indeed was starting to come about more. Jewish day schools were increasing, both amongst Reform, conservative, as well as Orthodox. And numbers of kids going to them, going to Jewish camps, was on the rise. But the general religious tenor of life of the West was not religious. It was moving away from religion. And you had a phenomenon going on that as a result of the Six-Day War, as a result of some of the Jewish reawakening, you had some people who were going back to Judaism, returning to Judaism, returning to Orthodoxy, the Baal Tshuva movement. And that had a big impact on the creation of yeshivot. A lot of yeshivot began to be created in Israel, where people from North America would go to study for a few years in Israel. And they created large Jewish communities in Israel as a result of that change. The women's movement came about. And as the women's movement came about, if you were Orthodox, strictly Orthodox, you don't worry about it too much. If you were anything but Orthodox, then it was a challenge to traditional Jewish organization of Jewish religious life. Could women be rabbis? Could they take place in the liturgy of the synagogue? And as these rose, so did the rate of intermarriage. Jews marrying non-Jews. Some converted, some did not. Those that did not, some raised their kids as Jewish, some did not. The next generation of mixed married families often had even fewer children who would identify as Jewish. The Reform movement, in reaction to this, was much opening of doors, as it were, to people who were intermarried. They had less rules and regulations that they had to deal with. Some of their rabbis were prepared to perform marriages between a Jew and a non-Jew. Some were prepared to join together with non-Jewish clergy to perform a wedding. Jewish education, on the one hand, amongst some was going way up. On the other extreme was disappearing. So the conservative synagogue, which maintained a large measure of Hebrew liturgy, became more and more difficult for people who didn't have a good background in Hebrew. If they were intermarried, they often found the conservative synagogue less welcoming to their what they felt as their needs if there's no conversion involved. And so the Reform were more open to those things. So the conservative movement began to age. The Reform movement began to take over many former conservative Jews for various reasons, some intermarriage, some for educational reasons, which influenced the Reform, by the way. That's part of the reason why the Reform today is much more traditional in terms of affectation. When I was a kid, you didn't wear a yarmulke in a Reform synagogue. Nobody would wear a yarmulke in a Reform synagogue. You'll be asked to take your hat off if you walked into a Reform synagogue. Today, not only do you have many people wearing a yarmulke, you also find people wearing a talit. One of the things that was clearly identifiable difference between a conservative and Reform synagogue was men wore the talis and Reform men did not, along with the yarmulke. So that's had an impact, as well as a greater Zionistic movement in the early 21st century in the Reform movement. So all those taken together, but the Reform also lost people on their end to other groupings that have come about. When I was growing up, we talked about a conservative and Reform and Orthodox. Later on, you started talking about Reconstructionism. It started by Mordechai Kaplan, which is heavily based on sociology. I'm not going to have time to go through all of that to touch everything I want to touch upon tonight. But you also, then you have what are called, I don't want to be nasty. Various kinds of, New Age influenced religious movements, more spiritual in their understanding of what it's like. The Jewish Renewal Movement, which endeavors to invigorate modern Judaism with Kabbalistic, Hasidic, and musical practices. They introduce traditions of mysticism, meditation. That's part of it. Gender equality, ecstatic prayer, the introduction of some elements of what you will find across the modern spiritual world, regardless of other aspects to it. So that has come into being. So you have a picture today of a wide range of approaches towards Jewish living and Jewish life. Now, there's a study, 250 pages or so, which I don't expect anybody to read. I just glanced at it so far. Pew Research Institute talks about what it's to be Jewish in America. It finds that many Jewish Americans participate at least occasionally, both in some traditional religious practices, like going to synagogue or fasting in Yom Kippur, and in some Jewish cultural activities, which they listed like making potato latkes or watching Israeli movies or reading Jewish news online. And among young Jewish adults, two sharply divergent expressions of Jewishness appear to be gaining ground. One involving religion deeply enmeshed in every aspect of life, that's the rise of the more Orthodox, and the other involving little or no religion at all, but only seeing themselves as ethnically, culturally Jewish. And that's why I said earlier when I mentioned the fact that 27% of American Jews, Jewish adults who identify as Jewish, don't identify by religion as Jewish. And we just had the census, the Canadian census. It'll be interesting to see what we can get out of that. But the last one, the last Canadian Jewish census gave us which was 20 years ago, that we've got the data from, had a total Jewish population of 391,665 Jews in Canada. 16.9% of Canadian Jews are 65 or older. 25% of Quebec Jews have French as their mother tongue. 62% are bilingual. By the way, interestingly enough, when we talk about Canadian Judaism, there are a number of factors that we have to be cognizant of. One, there's a large percentage of Canadian Jews came after the Holocaust. That had a major impact on the Jewish community, so that their children are children of survivors, and with all that comes from that. There was a much greater possibility and desirability of Jewish day schools in Canada. When you had the idea of not, in the United States, it was the melting pot. Here in Canada, we have whatever we want to have. What's the terminology we use here? Well, you do your own thing. No, that's not what I'm thinking of. But anyways, anathema in the United States. You did want to say something? All right.
I was going to say multicultural.
Yeah, thank you. Multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism has been good for Jews. Actually, it has been good for Jews. The day schools have profited by that. Jewish identity has profited by that. Jewish community as a whole has profited by that. There was less influence of reform here. Holy Blossom, which is the largest Reform congregation, if you ever read about the history of Holy Blossom, it's interesting. It began Orthodox sort of, and over the years developed. Adi says about the population. Now, remember, this is the 391,000 that I gave. That is based, as I understand it, on the 2011 National Household Survey. So that could have changed. The estimates for the U.S. Jewish population, for example, is larger than they thought from before. So it's possible there's more. According to that, we have only 188,710 Jews in Toronto, or Greater Toronto, with 90,780 in Montreal. Vancouver is third with 26,000, Ottawa 14, Winnipeg almost 14, Calgary with 8,300, Edmonton 5,500, Hamilton 5,100. Then now we're down Victoria 2,700, London 2,600, Halifax 2,100, Windsor 1,500, Kitchener 2,000, and Kingston 1,100. All right. But that's all I can tell you is that that's what numbers I've got right now. How accurate they are, we just did. I don't know if you do fill out your census forms. How do you identify yourself? What's your ethnic identity? How did you put that down there? I have no idea what I don't even remember what I did. Maybe I put American. I don't know. How do you identify? Do I identify as a Jew? Do I identify as I'm not native born, so I was not born in Canada. I emigrated from the United States. My parentage is all American, but my grandparents, well, one grandmother was born in the United States. Everybody else was Eastern Europe, either Lithuania or Ukraine. What am I? How do you identify? So, people have to, how do you identify when you're on a census? Do you identify by your religion? Do you identify by your race? Do you identify I'm Jewish because I'm culturally Jewish? Do I identify Jewish because I'm religiously Jewish? That's the Pew research was doing. Furthermore, Montreal, with the whole business about French and all the uproar that was taking place there, was why Toronto became the largest Jewish community in Canada. Montreal used to be. A lot of Jews transplanted themselves from Quebec, Montreal to the Toronto area. But also, interestingly enough, a lot of French-speaking Jews have now settled in the Montreal area of Moroccan and North African ancestry, so that the Jewish community of Montreal has a very high Sephardic component or Adotas Mizrach component to them, Orthodox, at least in basically. Synagogues in Toronto, the largest majority are Orthodox by numbers. By membership, I don't know. And the conservative movement has undergone tremendous change both in the United States and in Canada. When I was growing up, most conservative synagogues were not egalitarian in any sense. Girls, for their bat mitzvah, if I recall, in my synagogue, I think they chanted the Haftarah. That was it. My wife, on the other hand, her synagogue already had girls reading from the Torah and chanting the liturgy. Today, most of the synagogues in the United States are that way. When I came here to Canada in 94, there was only one synagogue where that was the practice. Today, most of them now have become more or less egalitarian. There were no female rabbis in town when I came, conservative rabbis in town. Today, there are a large number of female conservative rabbis. The leadership of the conservative movement, the rabbinic head is a woman, the head of Rabbinical Assembly, the professional leadership. There still hasn't been a woman elected president, I don't believe, and the new chancellor of the seminary is a woman. So certainly the conservative movement has changed tremendously, and I'm sure it's going to be changing in the future. I just want to go over a couple of ideas with you to share. Okay, what did I want to do? I wanted to share screen. Where are you? There you are. Okay, I'm going to take a look at this. First of all, I'm going to share a fascinating story with you. This chart has actually changed from when it was originally produced. It was originally produced and had different names and different understandings. It comes from a book about the conservative movement. And what it's sought to do was to kind of identify or give you an idea of understanding the movements and the conservative movement as their approaches to things. And I think it's still very worthwhile. I'm going to send you a copy of it in the mail, but I won't go over it now. So it summarizes very nicely educational and theological ideas. Okay. So on the far left, we have the most, starting at the top, Orthodox down to Reform. As you notice, it doesn't have the other newer movements in it. Method of study, how they understand revelation, authority, the Bible's laws and ideals, and ability to change Bible laws and ideals. Okay? So when it comes to Orthodox, there's no distinction between pshat and drash. The meaning of the text is the meaning that traditional commentators assign to it. For example, it says in the Torah, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Does that mean monetary restitution? Or does that mean physically an eye for an eye? Many modern scholars would suggest, although there's differences of opinion, it means eye for an eye. That's the actual meaning of it. Rabbinic tradition is no, it means monetary restitution. If you put out somebody's eye, you have to pay for their needs, their healing and the loss of that eye. The same thing goes with rabbinic texts. Whatever the accepted understanding of the rabbinic texts in general applies to those rabbinic texts. The conservative movement, all the others, distinguish between pshat and drash. The pshat is determined with not only traditional understanding, but literary and historical analysis. So getting back to the eye for an eye, you can see that Hammurabi had a very clear eye for an eye understanding. On the other hand, we also have suggestions that it was not supposed to be taken literally in the Jewish context. So there's evidence of both ways to understand it. But it is open to historical literary analysis in determining the meaning of the text. That doesn't say anything yet about how we use the text. Okay? Revelation. What is the nature of revelation? For Orthodoxy, verbal revelation. The Torah, including both the written and oral traditions, consists of the exact words of God. He gave it all as one piece at Sinai. It's a little more complex than that, but essentially what it's saying is God gave the Torah. In essence, Moses was dictated to. He was the stenographer. Essentially that. And that includes not only the written scrolls, but the traditions of the rabbis, the rabbinic tradition of the oral law. Now, in the conservative movement, there are various approaches. Some suggest that God did dictate his will at Sinai, as well other times, but it was written down by human beings, and hence there are might be explanation for the different traditions that found in the Bible. My teacher, Rabbi David Weissel Livni, suggests that during the time of Judaism's apostasy, during the First Temple period, maybe the Torah got corrupted because improper handling of it, and that gave rise to the various things. The more liberal you get, the more likely one is to see a greater human element in what took place. What in this chart was called conservative too was human beings wrote the Torah, but they were divinely inspired. It's not just a person writing something down, but God somehow gets involved with it. Another one is that there is a divine aspect to it, but it's basically human, and therefore it can change. The more reconstructionist tendency, it's not, as human beings wrote it, there's no claim for divinity of the product. And finally, what he called the Torah God's will written by human beings. As time goes on, we get to understand his will better, and better, progressive revelation. So that's how we look at the nature of revelation. So then what does that mean about the authority of the biblical text of Jewish law? Well, the Orthodox, it's God's will. God said it. That's all you need to know. As you move further down, more liberal, it becomes perhaps not just God's will, but all the idea of the covenant between God and Israel. The Reconstructionists is just tradition and the internal wisdom. Reform at least used to say the moral laws come from God, but the ritual laws have no authority, as they explained there, although I'm not sure they would say that all moral laws found in rabbinic tradition come from God anymore. Then the ability to change the Bible's laws and ideals. Essentially, Orthodox say you can't. Since God revealed the answers to all future questions at Sinai, man does not know more than God. Exceptions, there might be new situations, and you comply the tradition to these new situations. Sometimes there's a place to make a choice of one place, a person over another in the codes. The right-wing conservative world tends to follow the same Orthodox approach, but recognizes or tends to more lenient, recognize there may be cases of errors that crept into the transmission of the rabbinic texts, and as well as sometimes borrowings that come from other cultures that may not be authentic to Judaism originally. And as you go on further and further, the idea of change becomes more and more. What I wish to show, where the conservative movement has differed from the reform has generally been the insistence that it's not up to each individual to pick and choose for themselves, but it's the role of the rabbis to look at the past, look at the present, and make those decisions. And that the laws committee, which we've mentioned before, which we'll maybe get back to some time, is mostly hit it by accident. Okay.
Sorry, and the other question is, where is Judaism headed? Like, what is the fastest or the largest growing movement?
At the moment in North America, secularism. It seems to be, maybe it won't be, but right now, the fastest growing is non-religious. We live in a non-religious world. And for better or for worse, religion does not have as major a role to fill in many people's lives today. I hope it will change. I think it gives us something important, but that's still the reality. On the other hand, Israel is a different kind of circumstance, because in Israel you have a culture, a society that is Jewish. And what comes out of that mix is going to be Jewish. And it may have different expressions, and there'll still be all kinds of fights and things like that are a normal Jewish way of doing things, which is part of Jewish tradition. But because you are in Israel, you speak Hebrew, the calendar is a Jewish calendar. Even if you don't want to call yourself Jewish, you're in a Jewish world. And if you assimilate, what are you assimilating to? You're assimilating to a Jewish world. You may have a very heavy Western culture, which some are not very happy with. But here, let's take Toronto. If I want to assimilate, if I don't want to be involved with a synagogue, I can just disappear Jewishly. So unless I've got something to give Jewishly to the next generation, there will be no next generation, or not one after that. Somebody once quipped, who's a Jew? A Jew is somebody whose grandchildren are Jewish, or great-grandchildren are Jewish.
Well, Rabbi, you did make a point of mentioning the fact that even in the Reform movement, Jews are moving towards more traditional ways of practicing in terms of
certain forms.
Remembering.
Well, I would say forms. I don't think theologically. Okay. Theologically, not at all. If anything, they're moving more away from the more traditional theology of law and things like that. But look, you don't have to believe that God commanded you to put fringes on your garment to wear a talit as part of prayer. To have a garb of prayer can be something that speaks to lots of people. Some it speaks of mitzvah. Others it speaks of identity. Others it speaks of of a spiritual garb that sets you apart for the time of prayer. All of those are valid interpretations. The reform would not go with the God commanded us to put fringes, and therefore if I have a square garment, four-cornered garment, I have to have fringes on it no matter what. That they would not necessarily hold by, but they still would hold by maybe it's a nice practice. But there's a very different attitude that's involved with it. They don't have to run away from Judaism. There was a time that reform, and this was its critics, but I think there's a certain degree of validity to it, was running away from Judaism, from Jewish practice, because it looks too oriental, it looks too pre-modern, too far into the world in which they were living in the secular world. Today, they're comfortable with that. They're not worried about it. They're not running away from it. That doesn't mean they're going to run to every Jewish tradition. But for example, you have matzah on Passover. You may go eat. It always gave me the dickens when on Passover, and I went to school during the week of Passover, and I would have my matzah, and a friend of mine who I knew, a nice Jewish boy, had a sandwich, regular bread, eating his sandwich. To me, it was just not right. But okay, but that doesn't mean if he ate the matzah, he would be eating it with the same understanding of what the matzah is about. So that's it. So I think, if overall, I would say the reform movement has reintroduced a lot of practices and formula, in part because there were Jews coming from the conservative movement who were very comfortable with it. And so they felt fine with it. All right. Okay, God willing, I will send you this chart. You can take a look at it at your leisure. I think it helps understand. The best thing to understand is the more traditional minded you are in terms of source and study and authority, more traditional you're going to be in practice. As you move away from that side of the spectrum, your traditional practices are probably going to be less, because you don't have that same import. If God says do it or I'm going to smash you, you're going to do it. If it says in the book do it, it's a nice thing to do. All right, if I can do it, I'll do it. Maybe not. Doesn't speak to me, I won't do it. So those are all interrelated. They're very important. I think they're often, people don't understand that. Because a lot of Jewish practice, a lot of what the conservative movement was, and still is to some extent, was a lot of nostalgia. This is what we used to do. We were comfortable with it. Let's keep doing it. Which is nothing wrong with that. But how do you transmit that to another generation? How do you transmit nostalgia? I certainly don't sound like my father's father sounded with his Yiddish accent. And the fact of the matter is, I know far more Talmud than he ever knew. And he grew up in Russia, the old country, but he couldn't understand how I could be a rabbi. Then on the other hand, my brother, the black hatter, with the beard down to here, with 50 grandchildren, whatever he's got now, I forget the number, that my grandfather could have understood as a rabbi. He could understand that as a rabbi. So, things change, what have you. And, I've got on this computer, this little thing that I stick into it, and I've got more than the entire library behind me that I can just click and it pops up. what a wonderful thing we have today. And the fact of the matter is, there are more people today studying in yeshivot than probably at any time in Jewish history. That's why I say the Jewish knowledge on one end is way up here, and Jewish knowledge at the other end is way down there. And it's the middle area that we're really missing. So they say, Zil Gamir, go and learn, go and study. Okay, enjoy the wonderful weather we're finally getting. Time to plant gardens. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good night.
Night.